Anderson Eleanor adjusted her position on the polished oak bench, her fingers unconsciously tracing the grooves of the wood, while her gaze fixed on the defendant before her. The room seemed enveloped in a heavy, almost suffocating silence, interrupted only by the occasional creak of the chairs. She stared at the ERS, the detailed case report, resting on the seat beside her. The familiar feeling of frustration and disillusionment rooted itself in her chest. An old acquaintance that visited her frequently in moments like this. Another lost soul, she thought, swallowed by a system that seemed to drain the life from so many. But as she lifted her eyes, Eleanor felt a different blow, deeper, more personal. The hunched and shackled figure before her was not a stranger. It was James Anderson, her James. Shock constricted her throat, and for a moment she almost forgot how to breathe. Memories flooded her mind like an uncontrollable torrent. The hot summer afternoons in Hammond, Louisiana, when together they pedaled through the dusty streets until the sun disappeared. The long conversations under the starry cloak, sheltered by the shadow of the old magnolia in her backyard, and those innocent promises whispered, vows to protect each other against any adversity, no matter the cost. The man before Eleanor was no longer the boy who inhabited her most precious memories. His shoulders were hunched under the weight of years of hardships, his skin marked by life's intemperies, but his eyes, those eyes were still the same. Full of depth, carrying stories he might never tell, they cut through Eleanor's composure like a knife. For the first time in her career, her hand wavered over the gavel. The trial seemed to slip out of her control even before it began. She felt the room close in around her, the walls seeming to press against her as she tried to comprehend the impossible. When James looked up, his expression was a mix of surprise and resignation. He recognized her immediately, but then averted his gaze, as if refusing to carry the weight of the moment. He slightly bowed his head, an action that spoke more than words. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. Eleanor, taking a deep breath, forced herself to find her voice. "Mr. Anderson, you are charged with assault and robbery. How do you plead?" The response came, but not in the voice she remembered. It was rough, almost unrecognizable. "Not guilty, Your Honor." Eleanor's heart raced. She wanted to stop everything at that moment, ignore the formalities, abandon the protocol. She wanted to demand answers from James. She wanted to understand how that boy full of dreams had become the man before her. But she was a judge. Her role demanded control. Her tone was firm, though her soul was in chaos. "Proceed," she told the prosecutor, her voice carrying an authority she did not feel. As the prosecutor began the opening statements, Eleanor's mind wandered to the past. This was not just another case, it was James, and she needed to find a way to separate the boy she had known from the man facing trial. Memories came in waves, bringing back images of a shared childhood. Hammond, Louisiana, she on one side of town, him on the other, separated not by distance, but by the invisible rules of society. Eleanor's house, modest but well kept, surrounded by a white fence. James's, at the end of a dirt road, worn by time and surrounded by fields. Their friendship was a rarity, a deviation from the norms. She remembered how it all began, a casual meeting by a creek where Eleanor had ventured beyond her home's limits. James was there, fishing, his line tangled among the rocks. She offered to help, and that simple gesture turned into a friendship that defied expectations. She recalled one particular night, lying on the grass under the stars. "Have you ever thought about leaving here, Eleanor?" he had asked, his voice full of longing. "Leaving all this behind, going to a place where no one looks at us strangely for being together?" Eleanor had laughed at the time, dismissing the idea as a fantasy. But James wasn't joking. He had always seen the world as it was, unfair and relentless. The whispers, the disapproving looks, the veiled criticisms, none of that separated them, at least until that fateful day. It was the summer before high school, when Eleanor's father found them sitting together on the porch. "Eleanor, come inside now," he ordered, his voice laden with unquestionable authority. James, calm, simply whispered, "I'll be back. See you around." But she never really saw him again. Life tore them apart for good. Eleanor was forbidden from approaching him, and soon after James's family left town. She threw herself into her studies, determined to overcome the limitations of the town that seemed to imprison everyone around her. She studied law, graduated, and followed a path that took her far away but never erased the memories of James. He was the first to show her what courage was, even when the world seemed against him. Now sitting in the courtroom bench, Eleanor wondered what had happened to James after that day. The few lines in his criminal record painted an incomplete picture: petty thefts, vagrancy, minor infractions. Nothing indicated a violent nature. But the current case was different. The charge was serious, an armed robbery at a convenience store in Baton Rouge. The clerk was slightly injured and the cash register emptied. James was captured a few blocks later, supposedly with the money in his possession. As the prosecutor described the details, Eleanor watched James. He was hunched, hands crossed in front, but his expression was enigmatic. Did he really do it, or was there more to the story? When the court was adjourned for lunch, Eleanor finally had a moment to process everything. Retreating to her chambers, she was approached by her assistant, Margaret, who seemed worried. "Judge Hayes, are you okay? You seemed distracted." Eleanor hesitated, pondering whether to share what she felt, but admitting she knew the defendant would be deeply unethical. Instead, she forced a smile and said, "I'm fine. Just a lot on my mind." But she wasn't fine. Not when the past she had buried so deeply was now sitting just a few meters away, waiting for her judgment. When the trial resumed, the room was filled with tension, and even the slightest movement seemed amplified. Reporters scribbled furiously as the prosecutor, Richard Powell, took center stage with an almost arrogant air of confidence. Powell had the kind of presence that demanded attention, and his voice cut through the air with calculated precision. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began with a firm and meticulous tone, "this case is about gratuitous violence. It's about a man who entered a convenience store and, without provocation, attacked an employee before stealing the cash from the register. The evidence will show that James Anderson is guilty of this crime." Eleanor felt a knot tighten in her stomach as she listened. Powell presented James as nothing more than a number, a statistic, as if he were just another mark on his criminal record. She looked at James, whose posture remained tense but resigned. He avoided any eye contact with her, his gaze fixed on the table in front of him, as if trying to become invisible. Then it was the defense attorney, Lisa Porter, turned to stand. Despite being young, her confidence was palpable, and her voice filled the room with a clarity that defied the prosecutor's narrative. "The prosecution wants you to believe this case is straightforward, but the truth is quite different," Lisa declared. "My client, James Anderson, has pleaded not guilty from the start. We will show that there is more to this story, and that the assumptions made on the night of his arrest do not hold up under scrutiny." The first to testify was the clerk who worked the night of the incident. He described the events in detail, but something in his testimony sounded rehearsed. Lisa noticed this and took advantage of the opportunity during cross-examination. "Mr. Chambers, you mentioned that the man who attacked the employee was wearing a red hoodie, correct?" "Yes," the witness replied. "And you saw his face clearly?" Lisa asked, crossing her arms. "Well, not exactly. It was dark, and he was wearing the hood." Lisa nodded as if she had expected that answer. "So you're saying you couldn't positively identify who committed the robbery?" The clerk's silence was as revealing as any answer. "No more questions," Lisa concluded, leaving the room to absorb the impact. Eleanor watched James, who shifted slightly in his seat, as if that moment gave him a small spark of hope. But the prosecution still had its main evidence, the store's surveillance video. When the recording was played, Eleanor watched attentively. The footage was far from clear, grainy and dark, showing a figure in a red hoodie entering the store and moving quickly before disappearing. The prosecutor argued it was James, but the images left much room for doubt. As the video played, Eleanor found herself questioning, "Does this really prove anything? Could it really be James in that recording?" Uncertainty was etched on her expression, even if she tried to hide it. The defense, in turn, presented James's alibi. He claimed to be returning from a friend's house at the time of the crime. However, the friend refused to testify, fearing retaliation from the community. Lisa argued that the absence of a witness did not invalidate James's alibi, but the jury seemed skeptical. Eleanor felt the weight of her position. She needed to be impartial, but how could she when every detail of the case brought back memories of her childhood? The boy who had once been her closest friend was now fighting for his freedom, and she had the power to decide his fate. When the court was adjourned for the day, Eleanor remained seated, her fingers tracing the edges of her gavel. She desperately wanted to speak with James, to ask what really happened, but she knew it was impossible. Any contact outside the courtroom could ruin her career and compromise the case. As she watched James being led away in handcuffs, her determination wavered. She had always believed in justice, but now she questioned whether the system truly revealed the truth or merely created convenient narratives. The next day, the case took another turn. Lisa called her first key witness, Officer Daniel Harris, who was responsible for James's arrest. Harris had an intimidating demeanor, but Lisa approached him with calculated calm. "Officer Harris, you were the one who apprehended my client, correct?" "Yes," he replied, his tone curt. "And you stated in your report that Mr. Anderson was 2 blocks from the crime scene when he was detained. Is that correct?" "Yes." "What led you to believe he was the suspect?" Lisa asked, leaning slightly forward. "He matched the description, a black man in his 40s, wearing dark clothing." Lisa raised her eyebrows. "Dark clothing? But the suspect in the video was wearing a red hoodie. Did you find a red hoodie in Mr. Anderson's possession?" Harris hesitated. "No, but he could have discarded it." Lisa took a step forward, her tone even more incisive. "So did you search the area to locate this supposed red hoodie?" Harris's jaw tightened. "We didn't have time." Lisa didn't miss the opportunity. "So, you arrested my client based on a vague description, without physical evidence linking him to the crime scene." Harris's silence was deafening. The tension in the room increased as the jury watched, each processing what they had just heard. Eleanor also felt the weight of the moment. The truth, she realized, was slipperier than she had ever imagined. Eleanor's gaze swept over the jury members as they absorbed the impact of James's final testimony. Some exchanged uncertain looks, while others seemed contemplative, as if seeing more than just a simple criminal case for the first time. Lisa Porter, still at the center of the room, maintained her focus. "Officer Harris," she continued, "did Mr. Anderson say anything at the moment of his arrest? Did he protest, declare his innocence? Did you ever consider investigating his claim, or did you assume his guilt based solely on his appearance?" Harris, visibly uncomfortable, hesitated before responding. "I followed protocol," he murmured, his words almost inaudible. "Protocol," Lisa repeated, her voice laden with skepticism. "No more questions, Your Honor." The room seemed to buzz with silent murmurs as Harris left the witness stand, his credibility clearly shaken. Eleanor felt her heart race. This was not just a trial. It was a confrontation with the failures of a system that always seemed to tip the scales against people like James. Then Lisa made an unexpected move. She called a forensic expert to analyze the surveillance footage presented by the prosecution. The expert explained with technical precision that the suspect's height and physical build in the video could not be confirmed as James's. Even more shocking, he revealed that the timestamp on the footage had been altered, raising doubts about its authenticity. The prosecutor tried to dismiss the testimony as speculation, but the shadow of doubt hung over the jury. When James took the stand, the silence in the room was almost palpable. Lisa had explained the risks, but James insisted on speaking. He climbed the stand with heavy steps, the chains on his wrists softly clinking. "I made mistakes," he began, his voice laden with raw sincerity. "But that night, I didn't do it. I was on my way home trying to take care of my life when they stopped me. They didn't ask anything. They just decided I was guilty because I fit what they expected." James's voice wavered, but he continued. "I've been fighting my whole life to be seen as more than an assumption, but I'm tired. I just want the truth to matter." Eleanor felt her throat tighten. James's words hung in the room like a plea for humanity, more than for justice. The jury seemed divided. Doubt, empathy, and uncertainty were etched on their faces. Eleanor knew that their decision would not just be about evidence, it would be a struggle against deeply ingrained prejudices. The final arguments came with full force. The prosecutor, relentless, insisted on the circumstantial evidence, appealing to trust in the system. Lisa, on the other hand, implored the jury to look beyond the presented facts, to consider the inconsistencies and recognize James's humanity. Eleanor, listening attentively, maintained a neutral expression, but her mind was in turmoil. When the jury retired to deliberate, Eleanor remained on the bench, her fingers tracing the engravings on her gavel. The courtroom slowly emptied, leaving behind the heavy silence of waiting. James, sitting alone, seemed calm, but his hands were tightly clasped. Hours later, the jury returned. The room was crowded again, and the air was thick with anticipation. The verdict was read in crushing silence. In the state of Louisiana versus James Anderson, the jury declares the defendant not guilty. The explosion of murmurs, sighs, and even some applause was cut off by Eleanor's gavel. "Order in the court," she said firmly. As the noise ceased, she turned to James. "Mr. Anderson, you are free to go." The room began to empty, but Eleanor remained, watching as James signed his release papers. For a moment it seemed he would leave without saying anything. But then he stopped, turned, and approached. "You don't owe me anything," he said softly, "but I would like to know. Why didn't you say anything?" "You knew me, Eleanor." She felt her throat tighten again, the words refusing to leave for a moment. Finally, she replied, her voice laden with emotion. "Because I couldn't. My job was to be fair. If I said something, it could compromise the case and my position." James studied her for a moment, his eyes full of a mix of pain and understanding. "Fair," he said almost bitterly. "That's the one thing the world never is for people like me." Eleanor nodded, looking away. "You're right. I wish I had done more back then. I wish I could do more now." James sighed, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. "We were kids. We didn't know any better. But now you know, don't you?" "I know," Eleanor replied firmly. "And I'm sorry." James gave a slight nod before turning and walking out the courtroom door. His back was straight, but Eleanor knew the weight of everything he had faced was still there. She sat alone for a long time, staring at the empty space where James had been, reflecting on his words and what they might mean for the future. Eleanor remained still in the empty courtroom, the silence around her echoing her own reflections. James's words continued to resonate in her mind. "The world will never be fair for people like me." She had followed the law, done what was expected of her position, but the experience had stripped her of any illusion that justice was a simple formula. Verdicts and evidence were just parts of a larger system, a system that often seemed to fail those who needed it most. The polished wood of the bench, the weight of the gavel in her hand, all of it suddenly seemed insufficient. Her role as a judge was not just to ensure the process was followed, but also to recognize the lives that passed through that courtroom. Each case was not just a number in the record, but a story of mistakes, choices, and circumstances that deserved more than a quick, impersonal solution. When she finally stood up, the sky outside was painted with the orange hues of twilight. The long shadows of the courthouse steps seemed to stretch infinitely, as if the building itself was reflecting the weight of the decisions it housed. Eleanor walked down slowly, each step marked by the promise she made to herself. She couldn't change the past. She couldn't undo James's pain nor erase the choices he had made or those imposed upon him, but the future was something that could still be shaped. As she walked through the now empty streets, Eleanor vowed to do more. Not just in the courtroom, but outside of it. She would use her position as a platform to promote change, changes that could not only protect the innocent, but also offer people a real chance at redemption. The path would be difficult. There would be resistance, doubts, perhaps even failures. But the memory of James, the boy she knew, the man she judged, would be a beacon, reminding her that true justice could never be achieved without struggle. When Eleanor finally arrived home, the weight of the day was still with her, but something inside her had changed. That night, as she looked out the window into the growing darkness, she promised to do more than just pass sentences. She would use her voice to give meaning to the words the system so often rendered empty, because in the end, She didn't owe this only to James, she owed it to herself.